The Ides of March. A murder meant to save the Republic, but instead it quietly gave birth to an empire. Let's drift through betrayal, ambition, and the subtle rise of Augustus.
Part 1. Julius Caesar, a morning unlike any other. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we begin with one of those mornings in ancient Rome that, if you were there, you might have thought, just another ordinary Tuesday. Except, of course, it wasn't ordinary at all. In fact, it was the sort of morning that would get repeated over and over in history books, not because of the sunshine or the coffee, well, wine for Romans, but because of the dramatic and slightly awkward way politics, friendship, and betrayal collided. And yes, we're talking about Julius Caesar. Now, let's set the scene slowly, because that's what we're here for. Relaxed, cozy storytelling. Picture the city of Rome in 44 BCE. It's early March, a time they call the Ides of March. Sounds fancy, doesn't it? Ides, like some kind of mystical deadline for your taxes or maybe a ritual involving goats. But really, it just meant the 15th of March. Caesar, the man of the hour, was planning to go to the Senate. Nothing special about that, except for the fact that the Senate had decided to be unusually dramatic. Julius Caesar, if you haven't met him, was the kind of guy who basically could get whatever he wanted, mostly because he was smart, ambitious, and also had the uncanny ability to make friends and enemies at the same time. His resume included military conquests, political cleverness, and a certain flair for self-promotion that would make modern Instagram influencers blush. Naturally, not everyone loved him. Some people tolerated him, some admired him reluctantly, and some were openly plotting his downfall, though probably in a very polite Roman way, like sending slightly passive-aggressive letters or sighing a lot in public. Let's talk briefly about Caesar's personal style, because, well, it's part of the charm of history. He was said to have a certain charisma, handsome, commanding, and notably only slightly balding. Rome was very particular about hair for some reason, and while he had that confidence that comes from being consistently right about wars and politics, he also had a bit of a temper, which we'll see manifested in very subtle ways on the fateful morning. By now, the conspirators were already starting to fidget. Brutus, Cassius, Casca. These were not your average senators. They were elite Romans, the kind of people who would have kept a meticulous record of their togas and probably argued over the proper folding techniques. But on this morning, they were united by a shared desire to remove Caesar from power. And when I say remove, I mean permanently. Because in Rome, political disagreements tended to escalate a bit more than a simple debate over cheese imports. The plot had been brewing for months. You see, Caesar had recently been declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, which to most Romans probably sounded like, hey, we're just going to let him run the country forever, because why not? Naturally, this raised eyebrows, clenched jaws, and probably some very loud sighs in the Senate corridors. Some senators, particularly the conservative faction called the Optimates, felt that this was a slippery slope straight to monarchy, and Rome had a deep, long-standing allergy to kings. The irony, of course, is that Caesar probably was not the most tyrannical monarch ever, more like a very ambitious manager who liked being liked. But in politics, perception is everything, and perception can be extremely unforgiving. Let's float over to the conspirators for a moment. Brutus is a fascinating study in polite indecisiveness. A philosopher's type, stoic, deeply conflicted. You could almost imagine him practicing his speeches in front of a mirror, thinking, do I stab him with honor, or do I politely suggest he take a long vacation instead? Cassius, on the other hand, was less about philosophical reflection and more about simmering resentment. He had personal reasons, grudges, and a very active imagination about what Caesar might do if he ever got too comfortable with his new power. Together they make a charmingly dysfunctional duo, Brutus, torn by ethics, and Cassius, perpetually irritated. Now, Caesar himself had some sense of unease that morning. Not that he was overly paranoid. After all, he'd survived numerous wars, political rivalries, and even a few questionable love affairs. But Rome has a funny way of making its leaders feel slightly exposed. Friends whispering behind their back, allies with their own ambitions, the usual Senate shenanigans. He probably sipped his wine, nodded politely to a few senators, and thought, the usual politicking. The conspirators had decided on a location, the Theater of Pompeii, where the Senate was conveniently meeting. This was not a sprawling stadium or a dramatic cliffside. It was essentially a fairly ordinary hall, which is perhaps the most ironic part of the story. A man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and basically rewritten Roman politics was going to meet his fate in a rather unassuming room filled with people who could hold a grudge very quietly. And so we arrive at the morning of March 15th. Caesar, ever the early riser, or at least early enough to avoid the worst traffic on Roman streets, arrives at the Senate. He's greeted with the usual mix of bowing, muttered greetings, and some awkward coughing fits from people trying not to look nervous. The conspirators circle around, each with their own internal monologues. Brutus probably thinks, "This is necessary, for Rome, for honor." While Cassius is more along the lines of, "Finally, he won't be smugly smiling at me anymore." It's worth noting, in this gentle glide through history, that the conspirators didn't go in with dramatic swords unsheathed like in some play. Roman knives were smaller, subtle, precise. And while it might sound undignified to imagine senators jabbing their friend, it was considered politically sophisticated. Efficiency and discretion were prized above theatrics, even in murder. As Caesar enters the chamber, there's a moment of polite chaos. Senators cluster, some making casual remarks about politics, others pretending to examine papers or nodding at nothing in particular. And then, in a gentle, almost sleepy manner, the first blow is struck. From there, the scene unfolds like a strangely choreographed dance of history, Caesar turning slightly, conspirators acting in unison, and the overall impression of calm determination mingled with chaos. The irony is palpable. A man who had crossed armies, outsmarted rivals, and survived countless political storms is undone by those closest to him in a room far too ordinary to warrant such monumental consequences. Now, historians often focus on the dramatic elements, et tu, Brute, but the reality is likely much more mundane. Caesar probably looked surprised, possibly annoyed. The conspirators carried out their plan with meticulous precision, but without the grand theatrical flair that movies love to imagine. This is, after all, Rome, where efficiency and order were prized even in acts of betrayal. Let's drift for a moment over the personal dynamics. Brutus was related to Caesar by marriage, making this an intimate, almost awkward betrayal. Imagine family dinners where one side thinks everything is perfectly fine, and the next moment someone is plotting your permanent removal. It's like Thanksgiving with extra tension and slightly more stabbing. Cassius, on the other hand, had fewer moral qualms and more of a finally energy, as though this had been on his to-do list for ages, and the rest of the conspirators were somewhere in between, a mix of duty, personal grievance, and mild social pressure. Caesar's death, in this calm, almost sleepy unfolding, marks a turning point in Roman history. The immediate aftermath was less about dramatic speeches and more about practical consequences. Political alliances scrambled, power vacuums appeared, and Rome started the long, slow slide towards civil war. For the conspirators, the moral high ground they imagined was immediately complicated by public opinion, which, it turns out, is an unpredictable beast, even in ancient times. Crowds mourned, some cheered, and some probably just shrugged, which is arguably the most Roman response of all. It's also worth noting that in the days following, the conspirators had to navigate the surprisingly tricky problem of explaining their actions without getting themselves executed. Rome, despite its reputation for brutal efficiency, was not always great at public relations. And here's a gentle historical aside. Caesar, for all his flaws, had been remarkably popular. People liked him. They admired his leadership. And as anyone who's ever tried to argue with a group of mildly disgruntled...
Part 2. Aftermath. Rome adjusts to an awkward morning. All right, so we left Julius Caesar lying in the theater of Pompeii, which, for all its architectural charm, was now the scene of the most politely tragic betrayal you could imagine. The senators shuffled papers, muttered polite greetings, and tried to process the fact that one of the most powerful men in the world had just been quietly removed. No fanfare, no fireworks, just a very Roman mix of efficiency, awkward tension, and slight social embarrassment. Now, let's drift over to the conspirators for a moment, because, as you can imagine, the morning didn't end with a simple sigh of relief. Brutus, Cassius, and their gang had expected immediate applause, perhaps a few grateful hugs, and maybe a lifetime supply of Roman olive oil as a thank you. Instead, they were met with confusion, some muted horror, and a general sense that public opinion can be, well, kind of a tricky beast. Now, Brutus, always the philosopher king type in a toga, probably thought, this is for Rome, for the Republic. Noble, right? Except that most of the people who actually mattered, the Roman populace, liked Caesar. They liked his reforms, his charisma, and importantly, the fact that he seemed to know what he was doing. So while Brutus was standing there thinking about duty, the average citizen was probably just thinking, wait, he's dead, but he was nice and gave out free grain sometimes. It's a gentle reminder that history doesn't always reward moral clarity, especially when popularity is involved. Cassius, on the other hand, had a slightly different morning. If Brutus was philosophically conflicted, Cassius was emotionally vindicated. He probably puffed up his chest, feeling that a long-standing personal grudge had finally been resolved. But even he couldn't entirely ignore the subtle problem of public perception. You see, Romans weren't exactly fans of a power vacuum. Killing Caesar might have solved one problem, but it immediately created a bunch of others. For example, who was now in charge? And how do you explain to a city full of people that stabbing someone is actually a patriotic act? It's a gentle reminder that history doesn't always reward moral clarity, especially when popularity is involved. Now, Antony, Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony if you prefer the slightly modernized name, enters our story. He was Caesar's ally, right-hand man, and a man with a flair for the dramatic, even if he didn't always need to be dramatic. Antony, unlike the conspirators, had a very different morning. Where Brutus and Cassius were thinking about honor and Rome, Antony was thinking about strategy, revenge, and, let's be honest, probably a little personal satisfaction. His reaction would shape the next few years of Roman history in ways that were, at the time, barely imaginable. One of the most quietly ironic moments is Antony's funeral oration. You know the one, friends, Romans, countrymen, the famous speech. But if you picture it in real time, it's not fireworks and swooning crowds.
It's Antony standing in front of a gathering of citizens, subtly pointing out that Caesar was, in fact, quite popular. He shows them Caesar's wounds, reminds them of Caesar's generosity, and gently encourages them to get a little angry. Not too much, just enough. And as history tells us, it works spectacularly. The people start murmuring. Then, slowly, they get unrestless. Then, well, riots. Classic Roman overreaction, handled with subtlety by Antony. Meanwhile, the conspirators are probably standing somewhere thinking, this is going exactly as planned, while realizing, much too late, that public opinion is not on their side. The quiet irony here is delicious. They acted to preserve the Republic, only to inadvertently catalyze its descent into civil war. It's like someone trying to save a fragile vase by throwing it out a window to protect it. The next few days in Rome are a slow unfolding of chaos, the kind of sleepy chaos that creeps into history textbooks as footnotes and moral lessons. Citizens riot, Antony maneuvers politically, using clever rhetoric and public appearances to consolidate support. Brutus and Cassius retreat to consider their options, which mostly involves strategizing over letters and slightly passive-aggressive notes about loyalty. And through it all, the memory of Caesar looms, a constant, quiet presence that no amount of polite justification can erase. Now let's talk briefly about the personal side of this drama. Brutus is perhaps the most tragic figure, in a quiet, understated way. He genuinely believes he is acting for the good of Rome. He's not motivated by greed or ambition, at least not primarily. Yet his moral clarity is, ironically, what makes his situation so precarious. People don't respond to virtue in a straightforward way. They respond to emotion, spectacle, and, importantly, tangible benefits like free grain and security. Brutus, trying to act with stoic detachment, is a man slightly out of sync with the world around him. Cassius, meanwhile, is a different flavor of tragedy, less about philosophy, more about ego. His motivations are a blend of personal resentment, fear of Caesar's growing power, and a touch of envy. And while he is arguably more in tune with the raw mechanics of Roman politics than Brutus, his emotional volatility undermines him. Subtle miscalculations, polite misreadings of public sentiment, and a certain stubbornness lead him down a path of slow decline, all unfolding in the sort of calm, almost sleepy way that only history can appreciate. Meanwhile, Antony is quietly clever. He doesn't rush, he doesn't overreact, he just lets events unfold in his favor, using careful words, gestures, and calculated public appearances. The genius here is in the subtlety. Antony doesn't simply demand power or seek revenge. He manipulates perception, leverages grief and loyalty, and slowly shifts public sentiment. It's quiet, almost hypnotic. And while Brutus and Cassius are busy philosophizing and fretting, Antony is weaving the next chapter of Roman history, step by careful step. Eventually, the political landscape settles into an uneasy tension. The conspirators flee Rome, which is perhaps the most polite way of admitting that their plan didn't unfold as intended. Brutus and Cassius find themselves building alliances, raising armies, and preparing for a civil war they had hoped to avoid. Meanwhile, Antony, along with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, a young man just starting to test the waters of politics, begins to consolidate power, slowly turning the tide in his favor. It's all quiet, strategic, and slightly ironic. The young man Caesar had adopted becomes the instrument through which the Republic's decline is finalized, all while appearing respectful, cautious, and measured. As weeks turn into months, the streets of Rome adjust to a new normal.
Mourning, political maneuvering, quiet military preparations, and subtle propaganda campaigns all intermingle. The conspirators, once central figures, are increasingly on the defensive. Antony's calm, steady influence and strategic patience begin to pay off, turning popular grief into support, subtle indignation into loyalty, and whispered fear into actionable advantage. So, if we step back and consider the arc of this period, it's remarkably mundane, if you imagine it properly. A lot of polite conversations, careful misdirections, quiet planning, and incremental shifts in loyalty. No grand battles in the streets yet, no cinematic confrontations, just the slow, gentle unfolding of consequences. And yet, despite the sleepy, understated nature of events, these months would shape the trajectory of Roman politics for decades. Finally, let's float gently over the human aspect again. Brutus, the philosophical idealist, struggles with guilt and the practical realities of political life. Cassius, the more emotionally driven conspirator, experiences the slow erosion of morale and influence. Antony, the quietly shrewd ally, leverages perception and public sentiment like a master of subtle psychological warfare. And Octavian, the young heir, begins to learn lessons that will serve him far into the future. It's all very calm, very ordinary in execution, but historically profound in outcome. And so we leave the conspirators in this gentle, ironic tension, acting for honor, yet gradually undone by emotion, circumstance, and the very public they had hoped to secure. The streets of Rome continue to hum with activity, citizens continue to gossip, and political power shifts slowly.
Part 3. Civil War, the gentle unraveling of Roman politics. So, we last left Brutus, Cassius, and their fellow conspirators quietly fretting over how things had gone terribly not according to plan. Meanwhile, Antony and Octavian were slowly, almost imperceptibly, gathering influence and support. And Rome, that famously temperamental city, was gently simmering with a mixture of grief, confusion, and a touch of excitement, though not the fun kind. Think of it more like waiting for bread to rise and wondering if it will collapse. The months following Caesar's assassination were characterized by an unusually polite and at times awkward tension. The conspirators had fled Rome because, frankly, their plan didn't come with a user manual for public opinion. Brutus and Cassius, each weighing loyalty, honor, and self-preservation, decided to gather forces in the eastern provinces. It's worth noting, in passing, that Roman warfare was often a slow, bureaucratic affair. You had to assemble troops, negotiate alliances, and make sure everyone had enough food and, of course, wine. None of it was particularly glamorous, even if history remembers the battles. Cassius, ever the practical and impatient one, began rallying forces in Syria. He had allies among provincial governors and discontented generals who were, like him, slightly peeved about Caesar's sudden permanent vacation. Brutus, meanwhile, more philosophical and polite, joined forces in Asia Minor. They communicated by letters with varying degrees of clarity, and probably spent a lot of time debating who owed whom respect and which provinces might be best for recruitment. The irony here is palpable. Two men who killed a dictator to preserve the republic now found themselves leading armies in a civil war, arguably undermining the very principles they claimed to defend. Meanwhile, Antony and Octavian, the quieter and more subtle operatives, were slowly consolidating power. Octavian, young and underestimated, was like a cat quietly watching the room while everyone else argued. Antony, more experienced and subtly persuasive, managed to sway governors and military commanders with a combination of charm, intimidation, and strategic generosity. Together, they became a duo that perfectly balanced subtlety and action. Unlike Brutus and Cassius, they were not overly concerned with philosophical purity or moral righteousness. They were pragmatic, measured, and effective. Now, let's drift to the human side again, because history is always a mix of politics and emotion. Brutus, despite his Stoic philosophy, must have had moments of quiet panic. Picture him poring over troop rosters, worrying about loyalty and muttering about duty and honor, while trying to suppress a creeping sense of dread. Cassius, for his part, was probably more vocal, grumbling, strategizing, and possibly throwing a few minor tantrums when supply lines or reinforcements didn't arrive on time. And yet, they pressed on, because giving up was not exactly an option, unless one fancied a polite and very permanent retirement. The two forces eventually met at Philippi in 42 BCE. Philippi, for those unfamiliar, is not an especially dramatic location, just a fairly ordinary plain in Macedonia, which is exactly the sort of setting that history prefers for a subtle, slow-motion tragedy. The first battle was tactically indecisive, though the psychological effects were notable. Brutus and Cassius each faced the reality that their careful planning, their moral clarity, and their philosophical reasoning could only take them so far. Armies are notoriously difficult to control, particularly when the morale of your troops is influenced as much by rumor, superstition, and weather as by strategy. Cassius, observing the battlefield with his usual mix of impatience and paranoia, misinterpreted a retreat by a portion of his forces as a catastrophic collapse. In a quiet, tragic moment, he decided to take his own life rather than face the perceived dishonor of defeat. This was classic Cassius, dramatic, emotional, and yet executed with a sort of understated efficiency. He relied on a friend or attendant to help with the act, which is perhaps the most polite form of historical suicide one can imagine. Brutus, meanwhile, maintained his composure in a stoic manner. He continued to command, coordinate, and hoped that things might still turn in his favor. But the odds were gradually stacking against him. Antony and Octavian, calm and steady, were slowly encircling the remaining forces, demonstrating that patience, subtlety, and the ability to influence perception often outweigh philosophical righteousness in the long run. In the following days, the Second Battle of Philippi unfolded with a similarly quiet tension. Brutus's forces, while brave, were increasingly exhausted and demoralized. Octavian's troops, disciplined and carefully positioned, gradually outmaneuvered them. Antony, as always, exercised his influence with careful precision, directing forces, maintaining morale, and subtly highlighting the inevitability of the outcome. Brutus, stoic but increasingly aware of reality, faced a decision that would quietly conclude his own story. He chose to end his life rather than be captured. In keeping with the polite, orderly fashion of Roman elites, this was done with help from friends and attendants, in a manner that emphasized honor over spectacle. There's a subtle irony here. Brutus, the man who killed Caesar to preserve the Republic, died as the Republic was effectively lost to history, his moral victory tragically overshadowed by practical defeat. History, in its gentle, relentless way, records this not with fireworks, but with careful notation. Brutus, the stoic idealist, dead on the field, still admired for courage as the political landscape had shifted irreversibly. Octavian and Antony, in the aftermath, quietly consolidate control over Rome. The civil war had been, in a sense, a prolonged bureaucratic adjustment. Territories were reallocated, alliances negotiated, and political influence rebalanced. Rome, ever resilient and adaptable, adjusted to new leadership, not with sudden upheaval, but through careful incremental changes, subtle appointments, public appearances, and the ever-important management of perception. Here is where the human and the political intersect in the most gently ironic way. Octavian, young and underestimated, learned quickly. He observed Antony, studied public sentiment, and began positioning himself as the stabilizing, inevitable force guiding the Republic, or, as it would quietly become, the emerging empire. Antony, experienced, clever, and somewhat theatrical, leveraged his military and political influence to maintain authority while subtly preparing for the next stage of Roman politics. Meanwhile, the ghostly memory of Caesar lingered, not as an active force, but as a gentle, omnipresent reminder of what had been lost and what had been quietly achieved. Now, let's return for a moment to the common Roman citizen. From the ground level, events unfolded in a slightly sleepy, almost bureaucratic manner. People mourned, argued, and sometimes rioted, but largely life continued. Markets opened, taxes were collected, and ordinary Romans went about their days with the usual mixture of curiosity and mild concern. Political upheaval, no matter how monumental, is always filtered through the mundane realities of daily life: food, work, family, and gossip. The fates of the conspirators, while tragic, are also instructive. Brutus and Cassius, motivated by principle, were ultimately undone by the unpredictability of human emotion, loyalty, and perception. Antony and Octavian, less concerned with philosophical purity, succeeded through subtlety, patience, and the ability to harness the slow currents of public opinion. The moral is quietly ironic. Action guided by moral clarity does not always triumph over pragmatism, even when executed with courage and honor. There's also a gently humorous contrast in how the final stages of this civil conflict played out. Brutus, the philosopher-soldier, dies quietly on a battlefield, fulfilling his own stoic ideals. Cassius, emotional and reactive, meets a dramatic yet orderly end. Antony, ever theatrical yet careful, rises to consolidate power. Octavian, young and underestimated, slowly emerges as the ultimate authority. The world continues, almost politely indifferent to the dramas of even the most prominent individuals. In the months following Philippi, Antony and Octavian subtly divide responsibilities. Antony takes the eastern provinces, indulging in somewhat excessive displays of influence and social performance, including his famously cozy relationship with Cleopatra, which adds a touch of leisurely glamour to otherwise mundane political duties. Octavian remains in Rome, steadily building his influence, making careful appointments and cultivating the image of the inevitable, steady hand guiding the Republic, or, as it would quietly become, the emerging empire. The beauty of this period, from a sleepy historian's perspective, is the subtle, almost hypnotic unfolding of events. There's no need for dramatic flair, no need for intense battles or shocking speeches. Instead, history drifts along like a slow river, with currents of human emotion, subtle power plays, and incremental shifts in loyalty guiding its course. Rome, resilient and adaptable, continues to function, while the people who shape these events, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, Octavian, move through their roles with varying degrees of awareness, efficiency, and emotional investment. And so, as we drift...
Part 4. Octavian emerges, the quiet birth of an empire. So, we've followed Caesar through his fateful morning, watched the conspirators flounder, and seen civil war creep along like a slow-moving cloud over the Roman world. Now let's float gently into the final act, where Octavian, the quiet, young, slightly underestimated heir, gradually and almost imperceptibly takes center stage. Octavian, remember, was only 18 when Caesar was assassinated. A teenager by modern standards, and perhaps one of the youngest major political players in recorded history. He had been adopted in Caesar's will, which gave him both the inheritance and the not-so-subtle implication that he would someday take on Caesar's mantle. The subtle irony here is delicious. The man who would become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, started out as a quiet, slightly awkward young man who probably spent his mornings trying to figure out which senators could be trusted and which ones were plotting his polite removal. Octavian's early days are characterized by patience, observation, and an almost hypnotic calm. While Antony ruffles feathers in the East and indulges in his rather spectacularly glamorous lifestyle, Octavian consolidates power in Rome with a gentle, careful hand. He positions himself as a stabilizing force, a reasonable presence amidst the chaos, and, importantly, he cultivates the memory of Caesar in the public consciousness. Monuments, speeches, coins, even casual reminders of Caesar's benevolence, all quietly designed to win the hearts of the Roman people.
Now let's pause for a subtle observation about Roman politics. Influence is rarely about overt power alone. It's about perception, reputation, and the careful management of loyalty. Octavian, though young though he is, understands this intuitively. He avoids dramatic confrontations, rarely overplays his hand, and lets events unfold in a slightly hypnotic rhythm, nudging them in his favor. It's a slow, gentle accumulation of advantage, and in historical terms, remarkably effective. Meanwhile, Antony, for all his brilliance, indulges in the softer pleasures of life. Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen, enters the scene, and suddenly Antony's politics are entangled with romance, theater, and spectacle. It's all very glamorous, slightly dramatic, and perfectly suited to Antony's personality. Octavian, observing this from afar, takes careful note. Subtlety, consistency, and restraint often outlast glamour, and Octavian is playing the long game while Antony enjoys the occasional distraction. The tension between Octavian and Antony begins to take shape, though in a calm, almost polite manner. Rome is divided, provinces are subtly aligned, and the slow, inexorable drift toward confrontation continues. But remember, this is not a Hollywood-style dramatic showdown. It's a careful, deliberate positioning of forces, political alliances, and public perception. The slow unfolding is what makes it fascinating in a sleepy, historian sort of way. Eventually, the famous conflict between Octavian and Antony culminates in the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Now, Actium is often described in dramatic terms: fleets clashing, smoke rising over the water, heroes and villains vying for fate. But if you imagine it through a more relaxed lens, it's also a very orderly, bureaucratic sort of engagement. Fleets are maneuvered with precision, orders are given carefully, and the decisive factor is often discipline, morale, and timing. Antony and Cleopatra, perhaps distracted by the grandeur of the moment, or possibly by each other, failed to coordinate effectively, while Octavian maintains steady control. The result is quiet but decisive. Octavian's forces win, and the stage is set for the final consolidation of power in Rome. Antony and Cleopatra retreat, eventually meeting their ends in their own dramatic but ultimately tidy fashion. Octavian, meanwhile, returns to Rome not as a conqueror in a fit of rage, but as a calm, steady figure who can gently reorganize the city and its political structures. Here's a subtly ironic twist. The man who would become the first emperor of Rome does so not through overtly shocking violence, but through patient accumulation of influence, careful attention to perception, and the quiet orchestration of alliances. Brutus and Cassius, whose idealism led to civil war, are gone. Cassius, reactive and emotional, meets a similarly tragic end. Antony, brilliant but distracted, succumbs to distraction and mismanagement. Octavian, calm and patient, outlives them all and establishes the framework for the Roman Empire. And through it all, the people of Rome, largely going about their everyday lives, experience history not as grand drama, but as a series of gentle adjustments to the world around them. In a way, this is the essence of history itself, a mix of ambition, subtlety, and human frailty. Great events often unfold quietly, influenced by emotion, perception, and small decisions that ripple outward over time. Dramatic deaths, philosophical idealism, and grand ambitions meet the practical realities of administration, discipline, and strategy. And the outcome, while monumental in retrospect, often arrives not with a bang, but with the quiet, steady rhythm of slowly shifting power. So, as we drift to the end of this final part, imagine Rome in the aftermath. Octavian, now Augustus, walking through the city with calm authority, senators politely adjusting to new realities, citizens gradually embracing stability, and the memory of Caesar lingering as a quietly influential presence. The Republic, once vibrant and tumultuous, has gently evolved into an empire, guided by subtlety, perception, and the relentless passage of time. And with that, we close this long, sleepy reflection on one of history's most famous betrayals. Julius Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, and Octavian each played their parts in a drama that unfolded slowly, quietly, and with a gentle touch of irony. Ambition, principle, perception, and patience, themes that resonate not just in Rome, but across all of human history, have quietly shaped the destiny of a city, a civilization, and the stories we tell about them today. So dim the lights, maybe take a sip of something warm, and reflect on the strangely ordinary, strangely human ways in which history unfolds. Betrayal, ambition, and patience, they don't always happen with fanfare, but their consequences echo gently, persistently through the centuries. And that, my friends, is the calm, ironic, slightly snarky story of Julius Caesar's assassination and the sleepy, subtle rise of Augustus.
Part 5. Reflections, Legacies, and the Gentle Fade of the Republic. So we've watched Caesar meet his politely tragic end, followed the conspirators through their slightly clumsy civil war, and seen Octavian quietly emerge as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. But history, as it often does, doesn't stop at the conclusion of battles or the official transfer of power. There's always the gentle, creeping aftermath, the personal stories, the subtle societal changes, and the small, almost hypnotic ways in which public memory transforms over time. Let's start with the conspirators, since their stories are quietly instructive. Brutus, as we mentioned, died at Philippi, holding fast to his philosophical ideals, but his reputation did not vanish immediately. In the collective memory of Rome, he became a symbol of honor, stoicism, and tragic virtue. People whispered about him in private homes, discussed him in Senate corridors, and occasionally used his example in moral debates. It's a gentle, ironic kind of immortality. His principled failure made him almost more famous than many who achieved temporary victories. Cassius, meanwhile, had his moments of subtle fame as well. His reputation for sharpness, ambition, and emotional volatility lingered in anecdotes, letters, and histories. Romans, particularly those fond of moral tales, used his story as a cautionary example. Ambition, unchecked temper, and impatience may seem like energy, but without calm judgment, they quietly lead to self-destruction. In a way, Cassius and Brutus complement each other historically, one tragic in philosophy, the other tragic in emotion. Together, they illustrate the gentle, persistent interplay of human character and historical outcome. Antony, after his spectacular defeat and the quietly dramatic end of his relationship with Cleopatra, fades in a more nuanced manner. He dies relatively young, having experienced both power and loss, grandeur and humiliation. His life is a quiet reminder of the subtle perils of indulgence. Brilliance alone does not guarantee survival when patience, timing, and perception are in play. Cleopatra, similarly, becomes a figure of historical fascination, her life and death retold with varying degrees of glamour and accuracy. Yet even her story, as dramatic as it seems, unfolds in a measured, almost bureaucratic way. Political alliances, public perception, and personal choices gently steering the narrative toward inevitability. Octavian, of course, remains the central figure in this extended epilogue. He transitions from young heir to master of Rome with a calm efficiency that borders on hypnotic.
He assumes the title of Augustus, reorganizes the political and military structures, and carefully cultivates the image of a ruler who respects tradition while quietly holding ultimate authority. This is the subtle genius of his approach. He avoids dramatic proclamations, stages minimal spectacle, and instead uses the slow rhythms of politics, culture, and administration to solidify his legacy. And it is here, in the quieter realms of administration and social influence, that history often unfolds most profoundly. Augustus institutes reforms in taxation, provincial governance, and military organization. Rome's infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, public buildings, is quietly improved. Citizens notice incremental benefits: safety, order, predictable taxation, and occasional public entertainment. These mundane, everyday experiences reinforce loyalty and cement the transformation from republic to empire. Subtlety, it turns out, is as powerful as armies or assassination. The contrast between the conspirators' dramatic gestures and Augustus's slow, gentle, and measured accumulation of influence is striking. Brutus and Cassius acted boldly, with moral clarity and immediate visibility. Their actions made headlines, altered plans, and created immediate consequences. But the long-term currents of power, perception, and loyalty, slow, gentle, and almost imperceptible, favored the more patient, strategic figure. Augustus's legacy was not born in the heat of action, but in the quiet mastery of incremental influence. The people of Rome, as always, are a gently ironic presence in this story. They mourn, they gossip, they occasionally riot, and yet, remarkably, they adapt. Public opinion is a river, not a dam. It shifts slowly, responding to speeches, monuments, and the subtle gestures of rulers. Augustus understands this better than most. Coins bear his image, public buildings carry inscriptions celebrating stability, and festivals quietly reinforce the message: Rome is guided, safe, and orderly. It's a subtle, almost hypnotic method of shaping history without overt coercion. Meanwhile, historians of later centuries would interpret Caesar's assassination as a dramatic turning point. But the reality, if you step back, is gentler, quieter, and far more ironic. A violent act meant to preserve the Republic indirectly accelerates its transformation into an empire. The moral clarity of the assassins is overshadowed by the practical effectiveness of the patient strategic successor. The grand lessons of history, ambition, loyalty, perception, and patience unfold slowly, quietly, and with a gentle, ironic inevitability. It's also worth pausing for a moment on the subtleties of memory. Julius Caesar, though physically gone, becomes a central figure in public consciousness. Monuments, coins, histories, and stories preserve his image, magnifying his presence across decades and centuries. The conspirators, equally real and human, are preserved more selectively. Brutus as the stoic idealist, Cassius as the ambitious schemer, Antony as the brilliant but indulgent tactician. Augustus, as the quietly patient architect of empire, is remembered for stability, reforms, and the gentle consolidation of power. This is the irony. The loud, visible acts of murder, war, and indulgence are often outlasted by quiet, persistent governance. Now, let's drift gently into the emotional undertones. For Brutus, had he lived to see the longer arc, he might have noted the tragic irony of his moral clarity failing to preserve the Republic. For Cassius, the lesson would be almost comically bitter. Impatience, even when combined with cunning, is no substitute for careful planning and perception management. Antony, had he survived, might have reflected on how brilliance, combined with indulgence, can be quietly undermined by consistency and patience. And Augustus, undoubtedly aware of these contrasts, likely felt a quiet satisfaction in achieving what others had attempted through drama and failed through haste. The broader Roman world, meanwhile, adjusts to a new normal. Provinces are reorganized, military command is clarified, and the previously turbulent political scene is gradually stabilized. Citizens, perhaps initially wary, come to appreciate the predictability, the safety, and the slow improvements in infrastructure and governance. History, in this sense, unfolds not as a sequence of spectacular events, but as a gently persuasive narrative. Power accumulated quietly, loyalty cultivated subtly, and society gradually guided toward stability. And here's a final, slightly ironic reflection. The assassination that was intended to prevent tyranny inadvertently facilitates a more subtle, enduring form of power consolidation. It's a reminder that history is not only about dramatic acts or moral clarity. It's also about perception, patience, and the slow, hypnotic rhythms of human behavior. The people who act boldly may be remembered, admired, or pitied, but the patient, strategic figure who quietly nudges events in their favor often shapes the course of history in ways both profound and enduring. So, as we settle into the gentle conclusion of this narrative, imagine the Roman streets adjusting to the new order. Markets hum, aqueducts carry water, soldiers march with quiet discipline, and citizens slowly accept that the Republic, as it was once imagined, has evolved. The legacies of Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, and Augustus intertwine in subtle, sometimes ironic ways. Ambition, principle, indulgence, and patience all.
Part 6. Epilogue. The gentle echoes of history. So here we are, drifting into the final reflections of our long, calm journey through Caesar's assassination and the slow unfolding of its consequences. If you've been following along, you already know the major players: Julius Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian, soon to be Augustus. You know the broad strokes: the stabbing in the theater of Pompeii, the civil war, the battles, and the eventual emergence of Rome's first emperor. But now let's linger a little on the quieter, subtler currents, the whispers beneath the headlines of history. First, the idea of legacy. It's remarkable how personal ambition, morality, and circumstance mingled to create the stories that survive centuries. Brutus and Cassius, those tragic idealists, are remembered largely for intent rather than consequence. Their philosophical reasoning, their moral clarity, and their tragic errors echo quietly, a reminder that noble intentions don't always produce the expected results. In fact, the gentle irony is that their boldest act, assassinating Caesar to save the Republic, ultimately hastened its transformation into an empire. Meanwhile, Antony, charismatic and brilliant yet indulgent, teaches a slightly different lesson. Brilliance alone is insufficient if tempered by distraction. Cleopatra, elegant and politically savvy, illustrates the delicate interplay between personal relationships and political influence. Both fade from history in a mixture of drama and inevitability, leaving behind tales that historians recount with just a hint of theatrical flair, but never quite capturing the mundane reality of their daily lives, planning, and small mistakes. Octavian, of course, is the quiet counterpoint. He shows us that patience, subtlety, and careful orchestration can quietly reshape the world. He doesn't triumph through sudden drama or moral heroism. Instead, he accumulates influence slowly, nudges loyalties gently, and consolidates authority in ways that appear almost imperceptible in the moment. This is the hallmark of long-lasting power: subtlety over spectacle, perception over emotion, patience over impulse.
The Roman people, the constant background hum of this drama, are equally instructive. Life continued, gently oblivious to much of the high politics. Citizens walked streets, purchased goods, argued in forums, mourned quietly, and occasionally rioted, not in a cinematic frenzy, but with small cumulative effects. Public opinion, subtle as it is, had enormous power. Antony's manipulation of grief and perception, Octavian's slow accumulation of loyalty, and the conspirators' underestimation of popular sentiment all illustrate the quiet, often overlooked force of collective human behavior. It's tempting in history to focus on the spectacular, the stabbing, the battles, the confrontations. But the quieter, mundane realities, letters exchanged, alliances negotiated, coins minted, speeches delivered, are just as consequential. Augustus' reforms, careful public appearances, and the slow restructuring of Rome's administration didn't generate headlines at the time, but they ensured the endurance of power, stability, and influence for decades. Subtlety, in the long view, is surprisingly effective. Another gently ironic theme emerges: the gap between intent and outcome. Brutus and Cassius acted out of principle. They were philosophical, thoughtful, and perhaps naive. They sought to protect the Republic, to safeguard ideals larger than themselves, and yet, in doing so, they inadvertently created the conditions for its transformation. History, in its quiet, persistent fashion, often favors pragmatism over moral purity, patience over immediacy, and perception over intent. Even Caesar himself, the instigator of this entire chain of events by virtue of his ambition and popularity, becomes a quietly ironic figure. His accumulation of power provoked his murder, yet the outcome ultimately consolidated authority under another, equally ambitious man. Caesar's life, death, and legacy all ripple forward subtly, influencing political culture, institutional structures, and the stories generations of Romans tell about power, loyalty, and betrayal. The theme of perception versus reality runs throughout this story. Public perception, when subtly influenced, can outweigh brute force or philosophical reasoning. Antony's oration at Caesar's funeral is a perfect example. He subtly redirects public grief into political momentum. Octavian, patient and observant, quietly learns to shape perception over time. Meanwhile, Brutus and Cassius, confident in the moral clarity of their actions, fail to account for this subtle yet powerful force. It's a gentle reminder that history is shaped as much by how events are perceived as by what actually occurs. And then there's the personal side, the quietly human dimension. Brutus's internal struggle, his philosophical deliberations, and his stoic acceptance of death show the quiet tragedy of a man caught between idealism and the messy realities of the world. Cassius's impatience and emotional volatility revealed the subtle ways in which character can influence fate. Antony's charisma and indulgence, Cleopatra's elegance and political skill, and Octavian's patience all illustrate that human personality is never just background. It's a driving force that, combined with circumstance, quietly shapes outcomes. If we imagine the broader Roman world after these events, the calm is instructive. Administration continues, the military maintains order, citizens go about their days, and culture slowly absorbs the changes. Empire emerges not through constant spectacle, but through a series of small, deliberate adjustments, strategic appointments, infrastructure projects, public ceremonies, and subtle messaging about loyalty and tradition. History unfolds like a gentle tide, rather than a series of dramatic shocks, and Rome adapts as it always does. There's also a subtle commentary on mortality and fame. Even the mightiest figures, Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, Cleopatra, and Augustus, are subject to the quiet passage of time. Their deaths, decisions, and personalities leave traces, but not the overwhelming cinematic presence often imagined. Power, influence, and legacy are gentle currents, flowing invisibly through administration, public perception, and cultural memory. The dramatic moments are often just punctuation in a long, slow narrative of human choices and consequences. Reflecting on the span from Caesar's assassination to the rise of Augustus, one can see recurring patterns. Ambition meets reality, moral clarity meets unpredictability, indulgence meets consequence, and patience meets opportunity. The grand sweep of history is composed less of spectacular events and more of subtle, cumulative influences. The careful nudge here, the strategic patience there, the slightly forgotten decision in a provincial town that quietly alters the flow of events. So, dim the lights, settle back and breathe. Picture the gently shifting streets of Rome, the quietly moving political currents, and the human dramas unfolding subtly beneath the surface. Imagine Brutus, Cassius, Antony, Cleopatra, and Augustus, each playing their parts, each subtly shaping the course of history in ways both profound and subtly ironic. The Republic gives way to empire, the loud gestures fade, and the gentle, persistent rhythms of human nature guide the city, the people, and the story forward. And with that, we close this long, hypnotic reflection on Caesar's assassination, its aftermath, and the serene, ironic emergence of a new political world. It is history as it often is, quiet, persistent, human, and gently ironic. Ambition, perception, loyalty, patience, and mortality, they ripple forward, softly shaping the course of civilizations, leaving us with the sense that even the most dramatic events are only part of the long, gentle river of time.